On the morning of December 7th, 1941, a Japanese admiral named Chuichi Nagumo launched 414 aircraft against the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. 2,400 Americans died that morning. 18 ships were sunk or damaged. The Pacific War began before breakfast. 2 years, 2 months, and 10 days later, the United States Navy sent 500 aircraft back. They came from 9 aircraft carriers. They flew over 1,200 sorties in 48 straight hours. One American plane appeared in the sky above a lagoon called Truk every 4 minutes, day and night, until the Japanese sailors on the ground swore there had to be 900 of them. There weren't 900. There were about 500, but they came in such continuous waves that when the Japanese survivors wrote about it later, they described the sky itself as having disappeared, blotted out, erased. The operation was called Hailstone. The man who commanded it was a wiry, weather-beaten, former naval aviator named Mark Mitcher, 57 years old. He had flown biplanes off wooden carriers in the 1920s. Now he had $400 million worth of American steel under his command, and he was pointing all of it at the single most feared Japanese naval base in the Pacific. And on a ridge above an island called Dublon, a Japanese vice admiral stood with binoculars in his hands and understood, in the course of one morning, something that the men in Tokyo had spent the previous 15 years refusing to understand. You cannot beat America in a long war because America does not fight with ships alone. America fights with factories that never sleep. This is the story of the day the sky over Truk turned black with American wings, and what Japan did next. His name was Masami Kobayashi, Vice Admiral, 53 years old, commander of the Imperial Japanese Fourth Fleet. He had been born in Yonezawa, in the snow country of northern Japan, in the summer of 1890. He had joined the Navy in 1910, 34 years in uniform, promoted to Vice Admiral in October 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor. On paper, one of the most senior officers in the Pacific. Twice in the 1920s and 1930s, the Navy sent him to the United States as a naval attaché. For roughly 5 years spread across 2 tours, he lived among Americans. He walked their streets. He toured their shipyards. He counted smokestacks in industrial towns where the factories ran 24 hours a day. He saw the machine. He never forgot what he saw. By 1943, when he was given command of the Fourth Fleet at Truk, Kobayashi was one of a small number of senior Japanese officers who understood in his bones what an American industrial mobilization could actually do. Whether Tokyo remembered his old reports, whether they chose him for that reason or in spite of it, no historian has ever been able to prove. What is clear is that they sent him to Truk. They called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Every message from Tokyo used those words: Gibraltar, fortress, untouchable. But Kobayashi knew what Truk really was. Truk was a parking lot, beautiful, warm, dotted with palm trees, and completely indefensible against the kind of enemy he had seen with his own eyes in Detroit and Pittsburgh a decade and a half earlier. He turned from the window of his headquarters on Dublin Island. His chief of staff was waiting with the morning report. The ships, the fuel, the aircraft, the routine numbers of a routine morning in a place that pretended to be safe. Kobayashi listened. He nodded. He said the things a commanding officer was supposed to say, but in the back of his mind he was counting something else. He was counting the days until the Americans came. Because they were coming. He had no doubt about that at all. 3,000 miles to the east at Pearl Harbor, another man was doing his own counting. His name was Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet. And by the first week of February 1944, he had made a decision that would change the war. For 2 years, Truk had been a name Americans whispered with something close to dread. Intelligence reports called it impregnable. Newspaper editors called it the Japanese Pearl Harbor. Pilots who had flown near its outer reefs described walls of anti-aircraft fire so thick you could walk on them. Nimitz did not believe any of it. He believed in the fleet he now had because, in the 2 years since Pearl Harbor, something had happened in the shipyards of the United States that no one in Tokyo had fully understood. American industry had gone to war. Not a metaphor, not a slogan. A literal transformation of an entire continent into a machine for producing warships. In 1943 alone, American yards had launched more fleet carriers than the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed at the start of the entire conflict. Not repaired, not refitted. Brand new Essex-class carriers. 27,000 tons apiece. each one carrying nearly 100 aircraft, each one faster and better armed than anything Japan could match. By February 1944, Nimitz had 9 of them within striking distance of Truk. He gave the order. Operation Hailstone, February 17th and 18. Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, the man who had won at Midway. Direct command of the carriers under Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, the old aviator whose pilots called him Pete. 9 carriers, 6 battleships, 10 cruisers, 28 destroyers, over 500 combat aircraft. The largest fast carrier task force ever assembled in one place in the history of warfare up to that moment. On the deck of the USS Enterprise, an aviation radio man named Dave Colley was writing a letter home. He was 22 years old. He sat in the back seat of an SBD Dauntless dive bomber, the plane he flew missions in as a gunner and radio operator, and he wrote to his family in careful pencil on Navy paper. He did not tell them where he was going. He was not allowed to. But years later, he would say the words out loud to a Navy oral historian, and those words are on the record now. For 2 years, Dave Colley said the thought of even flying near Truk felt like a death sentence. He folded the letter. He sealed it. He climbed down out of the back seat of his Dauntless. He walked past a row of Grumman TBF Avengers being loaded with torpedoes. He passed the door to the ready room where Lieutenant James Ramage of Bombing Squadron 10 was already going over target maps. Ramage was 27. He commanded VB-10, career naval aviator, quiet, careful, the kind of officer his pilots followed without asking why. In 30 years, he would be a rear admiral in his own right. But on the deck of the Enterprise on the evening of February 16, 1944, he was still just a young lieutenant standing in front of a chalkboard. On the chalkboard behind him was a map of Truk Lagoon. Someone had drawn small circles around every known Japanese warship in the harbor. Ramage tapped the largest circle with a piece of chalk. Musashi, he said, 68,000 tons, 18 in guns. If she's still there, we take her first. He paused. He looked at his pilots. If she's not there, we take everything that floats. Nobody spoke because every man in that room knew what Musashi was. The largest battleship in the world. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Sinking her would end careers, start careers, rewrite the war. They did not know yet that Musashi had already left. They would find out at 8 in the morning, 600 FT above Truk Lagoon, in the middle of a fight for their lives. Because 2 weeks earlier, on February 4, 1944, 2 American Marine Corps PB-4Y-1 Liberator bombers had appeared high over Truk at dawn. Altitude 30,000 FT, course 90, departing east. The photographs those 2 planes brought back changed everything. Kobayashi received the report before breakfast. He read it twice. He walked to the window. The lagoon below him was calm, ships at anchor, sailors moving on decks, a seaplane coughing to life somewhere out on the water. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Photo reconnaissance, high altitude, 2 planes. The Americans did not send 2 aircraft that far from base to sightsee. They sent them to build the target map. He picked up the telephone. He asked for a direct line to Palau because 1300 North to the west at his own headquarters, another man was waiting for the same news. Admiral Menichi Koga, 58 years old, commander-in-chief of the entire Japanese combined fleet. The man who had inherited that title from Isoroku Yamamoto after Yamamoto was shot down over Bougainville the previous April. Koga had already begun to move his flagship, the super battleship Musashi, away from the anchorage weeks earlier. Fuel was scarce. American submarines were everywhere. When Koga heard about the American reconnaissance flight, he made his decision within hours. He sent the order to Kobayashi that same day. Withdraw all major fleet units from Truk effective immediately. Musashi, the heavy cruisers, all operational fleet carriers, proceed west at best speed. Palau, 4th Fleet will remain at Truk with available forces. Kobayashi read the message in silence. For a long time he did not speak because he understood what the order meant. Koga was pulling out the pieces that mattered, battleships, carriers, heavy cruisers, everything that could actually fight a fleet action. He was taking them west, out of range, where they could not be caught in a single American strike, and he was leaving Kobayashi behind. With what was left, Tankers, transports, auxiliary vessels, ammunition ships, repair ships, light cruisers, so old they were nearly obsolete. Destroyers held together with rust and prayer. If the Americans came, Kobayashi would fight them with a fleet of ghosts. Kobayashi folded the order slowly and placed it in the pocket of his uniform. He walked back to the window. The lagoon below him was still calm. The great ships that mattered were still at anchor for now. In 6 days, they would begin slipping out through the reef passages in the night. By February 10th, the last of them would be gone. Musashi would sail west to Palau, never to return, and Kobayashi would stand on the ridge above Dublin Island and watch the future of the Imperial Japanese Navy sail away from him without turning back, without a farewell signal, without a word. He had 30 years in this Navy. He had commanded ships. He had trained officers. He had studied the enemy in his own country, walked their cities, counted their factories. He had seen what was coming. He looked at the lagoon one last time before he turned away. The Americans were 7 days out, and this time they were bringing the factory with them. The night of February 16, 1944, the Pacific was black. No moon, no running lights, just the low, steady rumble of 90 warships moving through the dark. Task Force 58 had been at sea for 4 days, fueling from tankers under radio silence, turning wide arcs to avoid Japanese search planes. Approaching Truk from the northeast, along a route Japanese search planes were not covering. By midnight, they were 90 minutes from the lagoon. On the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, aviation radio man, second class. Dave Colley walked past a row of SBD Dauntless dive bombers in the darkness. The deck smelled of aviation fuel and salt and gun oil. His flight jacket was still stiff and new. He had never flown on a combat mission over a defended anchorage. Tonight he would. The plane he was assigned to was already fueled and armed. A single 1,000-pound bomb hung beneath the belly. 200 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition sat in the twin guns behind the cockpit. The guns he would fire if the guns were needed. He climbed into the back seat. He checked the intercom. He checked the radio. He checked the guns one more time. Then he waited. Around him on the flight deck, other men were doing the same thing. Ordnance men tightening bomb shackles under Avengers. Fighter pilots from Fighting Squadron 10 climbing into their Hellcats. Deck hands moving through the darkness with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this 100 times. Somewhere below on the same carrier, a Navy lieutenant commander named Bill Martin was doing something no American pilot had ever done in combat before. Bill Martin commanded Torpedo Squadron 10, VT-10. He had spent the last 6 months of his life fighting for permission to attempt a night attack from a carrier deck using airborne radar to find targets. His pilots called themselves the Buzzard Brigade. They had trained on instrument flying, on radar interpretation, on low-altitude formation work in the dark. Every senior officer in the Navy had told Bill Martin the idea would get his crews killed. He was going to try it anyway, off the Enterprise. 12 TBF Avengers into the black sky over Truk Lagoon, guided only by radar returns off Japanese ships that had never been attacked from the air at night in the history of naval warfare. If it worked, it would change how the United States Navy fought forever. If it didn't, 12 airplanes and 36 men would simply disappear. 90 miles to the west on Dublin Island, Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi was already awake. He had not slept well in 10 days, not since Koga's order pulled the battleships out, not since he had watched Musashi disappear into the western horizon, not since the day he had realized he was commanding a harbor full of tankers with no fleet to protect. He walked the perimeter of his headquarters in the dark. The lagoon below him was quiet, ships at anchor, a few lights burning on the airfields at Itin and Param. Somewhere in the distance, a generator hummed. Everything looked exactly the way it should look. Kobayashi did not trust any of it. He had ordered the air groups to double their patrols. He had ordered anti-aircraft crews to sleep near their guns. And the officers under him had said, "Yes, Admiral. Yes, Admiral. Of course, Admiral." And then they had done half of what he asked, because after months of quiet, the men of Truk had stopped believing the Americans would ever come. The pilots of the 22nd and 26th Air Flotillas had been on high alert for weeks. They were tired. Their commanders had let most of them go ashore to rest. Truk had no working early warning radar to speak of. Every operator knew it. Nobody had fixed it. So when the first American aircraft crossed the outer reef at 4:43 in the morning of February 17th, 1944, no alarm sounded. Nobody was watching the sky. 72 Grumman F-6F Hellcats came in over the reef in the dark. They flew low, 200 ft above the water. Their engines were the only sound in the world. They rolled, they climbed. They fell on the sleeping airfields at first light. Eton, Param, Moen, Dublin. Every Japanese airfield in the lagoon. On Eaton Island, a Japanese mechanic was walking across the flight line with a wrench in his hand when the first Hellcat came down out of the pink dawn sky and opened fire. He never made it to cover. Rows of Zeros parked wingtip to wingtip erupted in flame. Fuel trucks exploded. A Betty bomber taxiing for takeoff caught a burst of .50 caliber and rolled to a stop with smoke pouring from its cockpit. The Japanese pilots who managed to get airborne were flying into a trap. The Hellcats were already at altitude, already turning inside them, already firing. Zeros that had been the terror of the Pacific in 1942 climbed straight into the guns of a fighter that had been designed specifically to kill them. In the first 30 minutes of the fight, more than 30 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground. On Dublin, Kobayashi stood on the concrete observation platform and watched the sky above his command turn into a killing floor. He raised his binoculars. He counted. Not the Japanese planes. The Japanese planes were already burning. He counted the Americans, and he could not finish. They kept coming. At 6 in the morning, the strike planes arrived, wave after wave of them. SBD dauntless dive bombers falling out of the sky at 70 degrees. TBF Avenger torpedo planes skimming the water. More Hellcats above them, hunting anything that tried to take off. Around 10:01 that morning, the ship that made the loudest death was the Ikoku Maru. She was 10,000 tons of steel and ammunition, a converted passenger liner turned auxiliary cruiser, loaded with explosives for the garrison. A single TBF Avenger from the USS Intrepid, flown by Lieutenant James E. Bridges of Torpedo Squadron 6, drove in low across the water and released his torpedo at $301. The Ikoku Maru exploded so violently that Bridges and his 2 crewmen were killed by their own blast. There was nothing left of any of them. There was nothing left of the ship. There was a burning crater on the surface of the sea and debris raining down for half a mile. Close to 1,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and crewmen went down with the Ikoku Maru in that single instant. 3 American aviators went down with them. Kobayashi lowered his binoculars. For a moment, he simply stood there. Then he raised the binoculars again because there was nothing else he could do. At 7:22, Lieutenant James Ramage led his SBDs down through the anti-aircraft fire over Truck Lagoon. He was looking for Musashi. He rolled his plane over into the dive and started down. Below him, the lagoon spread out like a map. He could see the airfields burning on the eastern islands. He could see the burning wreckage of what had once been the Ikoku Maru. He could see dozens of merchant ships and tankers scattered across the anchorage. What he could not see was a battleship. There was no Musashi. There was no Yamato. There were no fleet carriers. There were no heavy cruisers. Ramage pulled out of his dive without dropping his bomb. He climbed back up. He circled. He looked again. The big ships were gone. Every pilot in the air group understood the same thing at almost the same moment. The battleships they had come 700 miles to sink had slipped out of the lagoon before the raid began. But the harbor was still full of merchant vessels, tankers, and ammunition ships. Everything that fed the Japanese war machine in the South Pacific was still down there. Ramage rolled over and dove again, this time on a fleet oiler called Hoyo Maru. His 1,000-pound bomb went straight down her stack. By 8 in the morning, the lagoon was a factory of destruction. The Fujikawa Maru, an aircraft transport carrying replacements in her holds, took multiple bomb hits and began to settle by the stern. The Nippo Maru, a cargo ship loaded with tanks and artillery pieces for the garrison, was hit amidships and burned for hours before sinking. The Kiyosumi Maru, an armed merchant cruiser, took 3 bomb hits and slid under with her engines still turning. Ship after ship, hour after hour, the Americans did not rush. The Americans did not waste ammunition. They came in groups of 6 or 8, dropped their loads, and climbed away to let the next group take their turn. It was not a battle. It was an assembly line. Kobayashi understood that now. He had understood it before it started, but now he was watching it happen with his own eyes. Then in the middle of the afternoon on a burning lagoon, under a burning sky, one small American plane did something that no one on either side would ever forget. His name was on the record as Lieutenant Junior Grade D.F. Baxter, naval aviator, age about 26, pilot of an OS-2U Kingfisher, a small, slow, unarmed float plane that had been catapulted off the heavy cruiser USS Baltimore for observation duty. A Hellcat pilot from the U.S. Essex had been shot down over the lagoon. He was in the water, alive, injured, surrounded by Japanese ships and burning oil. Nobody expected a rescue. Nobody was going to attempt one. Baxter attempted one. He put his little Kingfisher down on the water inside Truck Lagoon, inside the most heavily defended anchorage in the Pacific, between burning tankers, under Japanese anti-aircraft fire from the shore. He taxied his float plane through burning oil to reach the downed pilot. Above him, 9 Hellcats from the Essex circled at low altitude. They kept a Japanese destroyer that was closing on the scene from getting a clear shot at Baxter's plane. They strafed the destroyer's decks until her captain turned away. Baxter pulled the injured pilot into his float plane. He shoved him into the cramped rear seat. He gunned the engine. He took off from a lagoon that was still burning on a stretch of water that had just been strafed by 9 Hellcats, under fire from every anti-aircraft gun the Japanese still had working on the shore of Dublin Island. He flew the injured man back to the Baltimore. That night, in the wardroom of the heavy cruiser, the pilot Baxter had rescued sat quietly in a corner and drank a cup of coffee that his hands were still shaking too hard to hold. He was alive. He should not have been, and the lagoon was still burning. Back on the Enterprise, Dave Colley climbed down out of the back seat of his SBD as the sun was setting on February 17th. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His ears were ringing from 8 hours of engine noise and gunfire. He had fired his .30 calibers at 3 separate Japanese aircraft. He didn't know if he'd hit any of them. He sat on the flight deck with his back against a wheel chalk and looked west toward the pillars of black smoke rising from the horizon. Somewhere in the back of his mind, without saying it out loud, without even fully forming the thought, he understood something. They had done it. They had flown to Truk. They had come back, most of them. 25 American aircraft had not come back. Around 40 American servicemen were already dead, or would be by the time it was over. But the fleet was still afloat. The Enterprise was still steaming. The bombs were still coming off the elevators for tomorrow. They had done to Truk what the Japanese had done to Pearl Harbor. Only more. He was 22 years old. Somewhere on the West Coast, his mother was probably making dinner and worrying about a son she hadn't heard from in weeks. He didn't know that on this same evening, all across America, factories in Detroit and Baltimore and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, were rolling out the next carrier, the next Hellcat, the next torpedo, the next 1,000 lb bomb. He didn't need to know. The proof was under his boots. At midnight on February 17th, the fires on Truck Lagoon were still visible from 30 miles away. Half the anchorage was underwater. The other half was on fire. And in the middle of that fire, Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi wrote a signal to Admiral Koga in Palau. The signal was short. It contained no self-pity. It contained no request for reinforcement. It contained only a summary of losses. At about 10 a.m. on the night of February 17th, a single Japanese aircraft came out of the darkness over Task Force 58. It was a Nakajima B-6N Jill, a carrier-type torpedo bomber, single engine, fast, low, and hard to see against the black water. Flown by a pilot who had trained specifically for night attacks on ships. He came in alone. American radar picked him up. Combat Air Patrol tried to intercept. He evaded them by dropping to 50 FT above the water. Then he found the USS Intrepid. The Intrepid was one of the newest aircraft carriers in the American fleet. Essex class, 27,000 tons, 90-plus aircraft aboard. Commissioned only 6 months earlier, her captain was a man named Thomas Sprague. The Jill pilot lined up his run. The torpedo ran true. It hit the Intrepid on the starboard quarter at the extreme stern. The blast flooded 3 compartments. It jammed her rudder hard to port. The Intrepid began to circle uncontrollably in the middle of the ocean, steaming at 15 knots in a wide, helpless arc. 11 American sailors were killed. 17 more were wounded. Captain Sprague fought his ship for the next 3 hours, reversing his starboard screw and doubling the port side to hold a course until his damage control parties could rig a makeshift sail out of hatch covers and canvas to keep her running east. She would be out of the war for months, sent all the way back to Hunter's Point in San Francisco for repairs. It was the only Japanese victory of the entire operation. The Jill pilot who scored it turned east into the darkness after his attack and was never identified with certainty. On Dublin Island, Kobayashi heard about the Intrepid 2 hours later. He nodded once when the report came in. Then he went back to counting the ships he had left. The list was very short. At dawn on February 18, Kobayashi ordered every ship still afloat to try again to break out of the lagoon, to run north, to run west, to run anywhere. He knew what would happen. He gave the order anyway because to leave them at anchor was to guarantee they would die where they sat. The training cruiser Katori was among them. Almost 6,000 tons, old, slow, not designed for a fight against modern warships. She had been at Truk because there was nowhere else for her to be. She led a small group of vessels toward the northern passage at first light. She never made it, because outside the reef, waiting for anything that came out, was one of the strangest sights of the entire Pacific War, Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance. Personally, the commander of the entire Fifth Fleet, the victor of Midway, the man who almost never left his flagship, was standing on the bridge of the battleship USS New Jersey with Task Group 50.9 formed up around him. Iowa off his port beam, the heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans, 4 destroyers screening the flanks. He was hunting. Personally, Spruance was not the kind of admiral who did this. Spruance was famous for staying with his carriers, letting his air groups do the killing. But at Truk, on the morning of February 18, 1944, he made an exception. He wanted to sink a Japanese warship with guns. He got his wish. The Katori appeared on the horizon at 7 in the morning, steaming north at 18 knots trying to escape. The New Jersey opened fire at 20,000 yards. 16-inch shells, each one weighing more than a small car, fired in salvos of 9. The first salvo straddled the Katori. Water columns 200 ft high walked across her port side. The second salvo hit. The Katori shuddered. Smoke poured from her superstructure. She tried to turn. She could not. The heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans opened fire with 8 guns from the flank. The destroyer USS Burns closed in and finished her with a torpedo. She rolled over and sank in 800 fathoms of water. Behind her, the destroyer Maikaze tried to fight back. She turned toward the American line and launched a spread of torpedoes at long range. Spruance's destroyers cut her apart with 5 guns before her torpedoes could reach anything. The Maikaze burned for less than 4 minutes. Then she went down. By 10 in the morning, every Japanese ship that had tried to leave Truk Lagoon on February 18th was on the bottom of the Pacific. On Dublin Island, Kobayashi received the news in silence. He had no more ships to send out. He had no more orders to give. He walked out of his headquarters into the tropical sun. The sky was black with smoke. The lagoon below him was a graveyard. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked back inside and sat down at his desk. He knew what came next. He had known it for months. Somewhere in Tokyo, at that very moment, the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff was already drafting the message that would end his career. The last American plane left the sky over Truk Lagoon on the evening of February 18, 1944. There was no farewell salvo, no radio message, no signal of victory. The strike aircraft simply climbed east into the setting sun, formed up in loose sections, and disappeared over the horizon. Task Force 58 turned its bows toward the anchorage at Majuro and vanished the same way it had arrived, silently, efficiently, on a schedule. Behind them, the lagoon burned into the night. When it was over, Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance sent a message that ran in newspapers across America the following week. 11 words. The Pacific Fleet has returned to Truk, the visit made by the Japanese fleet at Pearl Harbor. 26 months after December 7, 1941, America had come to collect. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi stood on the ridge above Dublin Island until the last column of smoke on the eastern horizon had faded from red to gray to nothing. He did not speak. His chief of staff stood a few paces behind him and did not speak either. Somewhere below them, A tanker that had been burning since morning finally rolled over and slipped beneath the surface. A soft, distant hiss, steam where there had been fire, then silence again. More than 40 ships, roughly 250 aircraft, 17,000 tons of fuel, more than 4,500 men. Gone in 48 hours. The exact numbers would be argued over by historians for the next 80 years. None of them would change the answer. Kobayashi turned and walked back inside his headquarters. He sat down at his desk. He waited for the message from Tokyo. It arrived 2 days later, February 20th, 1944. A single sheet of paper, coded, decoded, typed clean, delivered by a young signal officer who could not look his admiral in the eye. The Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff relieves Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi of command of the Fourth Fleet, effective immediately. That was it. No hearing, no inquiry, no opportunity to explain that the battleships had been pulled out before the Americans came, that the carriers had been ordered to Palau by Koga himself, that the fleet Kobayashi had been left to defend Truk with was already gone by the time the first Hellcat crossed the reef. Someone had to be blamed. He was closest. Kobayashi read the order once. He folded it carefully. He placed it in the same pocket of his uniform where he had placed Koga's withdrawal order 13 days earlier. Then he stood up. He would leave Truk within the week. He would return to Japan. On May 31st, 1944, he would be placed on the reserve list. His 34-year career in the Imperial Japanese Navy would end without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without a single word from the admirals who had sent him to Truk to fail. He would live another 33 years. He would die in 1977 at the age of 87. In all those years, he would never publicly speak about what happened at Truk in February 1944. There was nothing left to say. 2 weeks after Hailstone, Tokyo made a decision that told the whole world how Japan planned to fight the rest of the war. On March 4, 1944, the Navy activated a new command called the Central Pacific Area Fleet. Its purpose was to defend the Mariana Islands, Palau, and everything east of the Philippines. Its headquarters was placed on the island of Saipan, roughly 700 miles north of Truk, and the man they chose to command it was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. 56 years old, career naval officer, and the man who had commanded the Japanese carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The architect of the attack that started this war was being sent forward to command the last line of defense before the Japanese home islands. Nagumo and Kobayashi had one thing in common that no biographer ever seems to mention. They had both been born in the same city, Yonezawa, in the snow country of northern Japan. 3 years apart. The man who had opened the war at Pearl Harbor and the man who had been buried by it at Truk had grown up on the same streets. Now Nagumo was heading to Saipan. His new command had almost nothing in it. The Fourth Fleet at Truk was folded under him on paper, but Truk itself had been left to rot. He had the shell of an air fleet, some ground troops he did not control, and the fantasy that the Marianas could be held. On June 14, 1944, from his headquarters near the town of Garapan on Saipan, Nagumo wrote a message that has survived. The Marianas are the first line of defense of our homeland. It is a certainty that the Americans will land here. He was right. They landed the next morning. American Marines came ashore on the southwestern beaches of Saipan on June 15, 1944. From the observation tower north of the invasion beaches, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo watched them come. According to his yeoman, a man named Mitsuhara Noda, who survived the battle, Nagumo stood on that tower for a long time and stared at the American battleships lying offshore. He pointed out to Noda that at least 4 of those battleships had been sunk by his own aircraft at Pearl Harbor. 2.5 years earlier, he had put them on the bottom of a harbor in Hawaii. Now they had come back, salvaged, modernized, rebuilt, firing 16-inch shells over his head onto the beaches of Saipan. The battle lasted 3 weeks. On July 6, 1944, in a cave on the northern end of the island, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo took his own life with a single pistol shot. The man who had launched the war at Pearl Harbor had come full circle, from attacker to defender, from glory to ruin, from the bridge of a fleet carrier to the floor of a cave. 2.5 years from Pearl Harbor to Saipan. That was how fast the war had turned. But Nagumo's death was not even the strangest thing that happened to Japan's high command in the weeks after Truk fell. The strangest thing happened to Koga. On March 31, 1944, 6 weeks after Operation Hailstone, Admiral Nimitz Koga boarded a flying boat in Palau. He was flying to Davao in the Philippines to move his headquarters closer to what he believed would be the next American offensive. A second flying boat carried his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, along with a briefcase containing Koga's entire strategic plan for the defense of Japan's inner perimeter. The plan was called Z Sakusen, Operation Z. It was Japan's blueprint for the decisive naval battle the entire combined fleet had been preparing to fight since Yamamoto's death. Both aircraft flew into a tropical storm over the Philippine Sea. Koga's plane vanished. No wreckage, no survivors, no trace. The commander-in-chief of the entire Imperial Japanese combined fleet simply disappeared into the ocean somewhere between Palau and Davao. Japan would not officially announce his death for 5 weeks. The second plane, carrying Fukudome, crashed off the coast of Cebu Island. Fukudome survived. He was pulled from the water by Filipino guerrillas. His briefcase was pulled out with him. The Filipinos did not know what they had at first. They knew only that they had a Japanese admiral and a leather case full of documents. Both eventually made their way to American intelligence. By mid-May 1944, translated copies of Operation Z were on the desk of Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. 6 weeks after Hailstone, the Americans knew exactly how Japan planned to fight the rest of the war in the Pacific. 2 months after Hailstone, the Japanese combined fleet had lost its commander-in-chief and its master war plan. The dominoes had begun to fall, and they would not stop falling until the war was over. The next domino fell in the Philippine Sea. June 19th and 20, 1944, 4 months after Truk, the Japanese Navy under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa tried to make its stand against the American invasion of the Marianas. Ozawa had 9 carriers, 473 aircraft. The Americans had 15 carriers, 956 aircraft. The pilots on the Japanese carriers were young, undertrained, rushed through flight school because their veteran instructors had been killed at Midway, and the Solomons at Rabaul, and now at Truk. Some of them had fewer than 100 flight hours before they took off to fight. The pilots on the American carriers had trained for 2 years. They had modern aircraft. They had radar-directed air defense. They had a pilot rescue system so effective that a downed American aviator had a better chance of being picked up alive than of dying in the water. In 2 days over the Philippine Sea, the Japanese Navy lost more than 600 aircraft. They lost 3 of their 9 carriers, including the brand-new supership Taiho and the Pearl Harbor veteran Shokaku. American pilots called it the Mariana's turkey shoot. Every one of the pilots the Japanese lost that day had been trained in a program that Truk was supposed to protect. Every one of the ships they lost had been counting on Truk for fuel and repairs. Every one of the missing aircraft had once been supposed to fly through Truk on its way to the front. There was no Truk anymore. There was no ferry route, no forward base, no fuel depot, no repair facility. There was only a ring of coral around a graveyard of ships, and there would never be one again. Saipan fell in July, Tinian fell in August, Guam fell soon after. From those 3 islands in November 1944, the United States began flying B-29 Superfortress bombers directly against the home islands of Japan. The war was in Japan now, and 40,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen were still trapped on Truk. The Americans never came back to invade. They didn't have to. Truk had been erased as a strategic asset. Nimitz called the policy withering on the vine. The atoll was simply bypassed, left in the American rear as the war moved west. For the men still living on those islands, that policy meant something specific. It meant starvation. American submarines cut off every supply run. American aircraft from carriers regularly returned to bomb whatever new construction the garrison attempted. But there was no invasion. There was no siege. There was no dramatic final battle. There was only hunger. By the summer of 1944, the men of Truk were catching fish with grenades to save ammunition. By the winter of 1944, they were eating rats and lizards and boiled palm leaves. By the spring of 1945, they were dying. Historians later estimated that many thousands of Japanese servicemen on Truk died of tropical disease during the last 18 months of the war. Nobody counted them exactly. Nobody in Tokyo asked. The commander of that dying garrison was another man now, Vice Admiral Chihara. He had arrived in November 1944 after Nagumo's suicide at Saipan and the collapse of the Central Pacific Area Fleet. He inherited what was left, a base with no ships, an airfield with no planes, a command with no purpose except to keep his men alive until someone in Tokyo remembered they existed. Nobody remembered. Hara was 55 years old when he arrived. He was 56 when the war ended. In those 10 months, he watched thousands of men under his command starve to death on islands that had once housed the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On September 2, 1945, the same day General Douglas MacArthur accepted the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Vice Admiral Chihara stood on the deck of the heavy cruiser USS Portland in Truk Lagoon and signed his own surrender. He signed on behalf of every Japanese serviceman still alive on the atoll. There were far fewer of them now than there had been a year earlier. He would be tried for war crimes at Guam for the execution of downed American airmen at Truk during his command. He would serve 6 years in prison at Sugamo. He would die at his home in Japan in 1964. That was how it ended, not with a battle, not with a last stand, not with a banzai charge across a beach, but with a signature on a piece of paper on the deck of an American cruiser in a lagoon full of Japanese ships that had been underwater for 18 months. The lagoon is still there. It is called Truk now. The country around it is the Federated States of Micronesia. The population is small. The economy is quiet. The tourists who come to Truk do not come for the beaches because Truk Lagoon is the largest underwater ship graveyard in the world. More than 40 Japanese vessels sunk in February 1944, most of them still sitting where they went down in warm, shallow water, clear enough to see the deck plates. Divers glide through the crew quarters of the Fujikawa Maru. They swim past the mess tables of the San Francisco Maru with rifles and gas masks still visible in the holds. They pass through the engine rooms of the Nippo Maru with the ship's telegraph still set to the last order it received before the bombs came down. Bottles of Kirin beer still sit on the tables in the crew galleys. A ceramic cup rests on a shelf near a helmsman's station. A field telephone lies on a bunk, the receiver still in its cradle. Everything is exactly where it was at the moment the water came in on the morning of February 17, 1944. Nobody moved it. Nobody could. Thousands of Japanese sailors, soldiers, and merchant seamen are still down there. The Japanese government has never made a serious effort to recover them. There are too many, too deep, too tangled in the wrecks. In Japanese naval tradition, a sailor who goes down with his ship belongs to the ship. He is not to be disturbed. They belong to those ships now. That is what Japan did next. They blame one admiral. They sent the architect of Pearl Harbor forward to command a doomed defense line on Saipan, and they buried him in a cave 3 months later. They lost their commander-in-chief in a storm and their master plan to a Filipino fisherman. They sent their last pilots into the Marianas and watched them die in a turkey shoot. They gave up the Marianas and with them the sky over Tokyo. And they left 40,000 of their own men to starve on an island they had once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. But this story does not end with Japan. Around 40 American servicemen were killed at Truk during Operation Hailstone and the raids that followed through the spring of 1944. 25 American aircraft were lost on those 2 days in February and more in later attacks. Their names are on memorials in Honolulu and on cemetery walls in small towns from Maine to Oregon. For 80 years, most of them were listed as missing in action. Their families were told there was nobody to bring home. There was only the Pacific. Then beginning around 2019 and 2020, a team from the American organization Project Recover began locating United States Navy aircraft on the floor of the lagoon. 3 of them at first, more in the years that followed with additional surveys as recent as 2024. Each aircraft they found still contained crew members listed as missing since February 1944. Their families were notified. Some of them, now in their 80s and 90s, were still alive to receive the news that their brother or their uncle or the father they never met had been found. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi died in 1977 in a quiet neighborhood in Tokyo. He had spent the last 3 decades of his life saying nothing about what happened at Truk. His obituary in the Japanese press was a single paragraph. Retired 1944. No mention of the harbor. No mention of the fleet he had been left to defend with no ships. No mention of the years he had spent walking American shipyards in the 1920s and 1930s, watching a country build itself into a weapon that Japan could not outproduce. America fought with factories that never slept. He had seen it, and nobody in Tokyo had listened until it was too late. Dave Colley lived to be an old man. He gave his oral history to the United States Navy. He spoke about the morning he flew into Truk in the back seat of a dauntless dive bomber and did not expect to come home. He spoke plainly, the way men of his generation did. He did not embellish. He did not dramatize. He simply told what he saw. James Ramage went on to become a rear admiral in the United States Navy. He commanded ships and taught younger officers and lived a long life of quiet service. He died in 2012 at the age of 95. Mark Mitcher took Task Force 58 all the way across the Pacific from Truk to Tokyo Bay in the 18 months that followed Hailstone. He died in 1947 at the age of 60, worn out by the war. Raymond Spruance retired as Admiral of the Fleet. He served as president of the Naval War College and later as ambassador to the Philippines. He died in 1969, buried near his old friend and rival, Mark Mitcher, at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. The USS Enterprise, the carrier Dave Colley flew from, went on to serve in every major Pacific campaign until the end of the war. She was the most decorated American warship of the Second World War. She was scrapped in the 1950s. Her name was carried forward first by a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that served through the Cold War and later by a starship on television. The USS Intrepid, the carrier that took the torpedo on the night of February 17, 1944, was repaired at Hunters Point and returned to the war within months. She served for another 40 years. Today, she is a museum on the west side of Manhattan in New York City. Visitors can walk her decks. They can see the compartment where the Jill's torpedo hit. They can stand at the rail and look out at the Hudson River and try to imagine what it was like to be 22 years old in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in a fleet that had come 7,000 miles to answer for Pearl Harbor. That is what the men who flew Operation Hailstone paid for. You cannot beat America in a long war because America remembers her dead, and America comes back for them, even 80 years later, even from the bottom of the sea. If this story of industrial might and the ghosts of Truk Lagoon changed how you view the history of the Pacific, please subscribe and like the channel. We are dedicated to unearthing the history that time and tide have tried to bury. Join us as we plant the seeds for a deeper understanding of our past. The next treasury of history will be open soon.